John Baldoni, it's not every day I get a chance to connect with someone that I view and believe in my heart is truly a leadership guru. So books, courses, videos, programs, speaking, coaching, what don't you do? Welcome to the show.
I don't do financial planning.
You said that to me in the pre-note. I was really disappointed because I had a whole thing on variable annuities I wanted to cover. So that's
well, that's funny, Al. Art, it's such a fun to be with you. We've exchanged ideas over the years, and I'm a big fan of the work that you do, and I know that you're making a positive impact on the lives of others. How do I know that? Because I see the impact that you have, and you are making a positive difference, and it's a pleasure to have a conversation with you.
Well, thank you, John. Right back at you. I truly view you as kind of an at a distance mentor. So you, Wally Bach, a few other folks out there in the leadership community that I look up to, I look to for guidance. And again, how cool is it that I get a chance to talk with you and share with you my audience? And I know the audience is hungry for leadership insights and ideas and navigating the challenges in today's world. So why don't we dig in?
Absolutely.
So I have to ask you a question. I mean, what is the count? 14 books now with all the videos and all the writing you do. Where does all of this come from? What inspires you to do this?
What inspires me is I'm at core. I mean, my initial career was as a writer. You know, I was in corporate communications and a speech writer, and I worked for people at the top. So by nature, I am a communicator. And so my chosen field is executive coaching and leadership education. And so part of what I do is write. And I learned that a lesson. One of my idols is, of course, Peter Drucker. And Peter Drucker wrote a famous article about managing oneself. And he spoke about his own approach to leadership. And he said before he wrote something, he needed to teach it. I, at the time, was just the opposite. Before I taught something, I need to write it. I'm kind of more morphing into half and half. You know, sometimes what I say I'll put in print, or sometimes what I'll write I will speak aloud. So it's kind of a one hand washes the other. Maybe you could put it more simply, I just don't know when to shut up.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I guess I suffer from a similar affliction in the leadership writing. I think I just crossed over the 1,600 article count in different sources. So, and you know, the ideas just, you see them and hear them everywhere. And, you know, I sense from your writing and your work that you're driven by this desire to help others develop as successful, effective, graceful leaders.
Right. Well, I see something that's an example, be it from the headlines or be it from something I observe in the work environment. And I'll say, hey, that's an insight into a point of leadership that I want to explore. And so I do. So.
Good. So, you know, it's interesting is I read your books, and I just finished up Grace, and we'll talk about that. Love that experience. Such a profound book. The one thing that I find in your writing is that I don't necessarily learn an incredible amount about you. So let me totally put you on the spot and share a little bit about your background. You mentioned communications writer earlier in your career. Help us all better understand, you know, where John Baldoni, the leadership expert, comes from.
Well, as I said, you know, I'm originally corporate communications, and about 25 years ago, I got involved in I went back to school at University of Michigan, Dearborn, and I did a master's in what's called performance consulting, which is a kind of a mishmash program, but it worked for me. It was part management, it was part behavioral science, and part education. And I came out, and at the time, then that's impetus to start writing in my own voice rather than in the voice of others, which I had done as a speechwriter. And so interestingly, I met I got connected to some folks in Marshall Goldsmith's circle. And of all people, Marshall said, you know, you should be an executive coach. And so when Marshall suggested I be an executive coach, I went on a course of study and pursued that, and then became, a long writing about that. And then I started writing about coaching and lessons and how to be a coach and all of those kinds of things. And I'm not expert in the business of coaching, but I've worked with a lot of folks to help them understand what they can achieve as a coach. So my original background, I'm a small town kid in Ohio. I went to Georgetown, which is funny. I just reconnected with because we had a 50th anniversary, not my class 50th anniversary, I want you to know, but I worked with a newspaper there. And it was quite an engaging experience for a young person. And I spent some time in London. I was actually in film school. So and why I mentioned that is when I was in London, I knew as friends, a lot of actors. So I had a lot of exposure to the dramatic arts. And now as a coach, I often do presentation skills coaching, which I don't bill it separately. I don't advertise it so much separately, but it's often integrated if an individual needs it. So in a way, and a through point to all of this, I think, is stories. Whether it was a photojournalist or freelance writer or all these things, I was telling stories. And now in my books today, I tell stories. And it was a while ago, I was talking to a potential client, and he said, "You're really a storyteller, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah, I guess I am." And he goes, "You use that in your coaching?" I said, "I guess I do." So story is what, and why do I use story? Because I think they're engaging, but most importantly, that's art, how we learn.
Sure, no doubt. We literally, having just finished Grace, there were stories in there that made me laugh, that made me smile, that made me choke up a little bit. So, it's powerful, John. And I suspect it comes through in your speaking activities and everything you do.
Right. I try never to tell and always to show. Do I always follow that? No, but sometimes I do tell. But with a story, we can draw something from it, and that's a form of showing. And then when you're showing someone, you're giving them an opportunity to make it their own. Rather than say, "Art, do this," you are saying, "Here's an example of what this executive did or that individual did. Maybe there's something from there that you can learn," rather than hitting them over the head. And then sometimes with our clients, we have to hit them over the head, proverbial.
Yeah, right.
Part of executive coaching, I firmly believe, is getting people out of their comfort zone. That's what we're hired to do. And if we're there to just stroke their ego, that's not coaching,
Sure.
So if we ask questions that challenge their assumptions, we're helping them grow and develop.
I think that lesson on storytelling relates to the individuals in my audience too, who are, many of them, striving to persuade. So some of them have reached the point where they're recommending, product plans, business investments, new directions, process changes in those issues. And it seems absolutely essential that integrating story within their work, customer stories, customer challenges and pains and so forth, can be a powerful way to communicate.
Absolutely. I did a book called How Great Leaders Achieve Great Results. And that book is really a communication book in a sense, because there's a through line from vision through alignment, discipline, and courage. And I did a chapter in there on storytelling, and a spreadsheet can tell a story, and I often, for some odd reason, I have coached a number of CFO types and people in tax, whatever. And I say, don't shy away from it. But when you give a presentation, make those numbers come alive. You don't narrate the entire chart, but pick a number and say, "Hey, we saw this differential, it happened in May, and this is indicative of X." So what you're doing is telling a little story about a number. So stories come to us. And I think, as you said, Art, when executives are managers and rising up and they're in the persuasion game, essential to leadership is your influence. So you must use your armament, if you will, of tools and techniques to bring people onto your side. So don't shy away from data. Pick the most important points. It must be truthful, of course. I'm not saying cook the data, but in your presentation, pick out the key points that illustrate what you're trying to achieve.
So I have to share this anecdote here, since you mentioned CFOs. A dear friend who is the CFO of our software company, and Paul, I hope he listens and watches this. He was at the annual, or I'm sorry, the quarterly town hall, would always give the financial updates. And, you know, I've been in a million of these things, it seems like, over time. And I can tell you that I only remember one. And it was the one where Paul showed up. He carried his guitar out, sat down on a bar stool, and sang the financials.
Wow, what a story. What a story. You know, we had similar to that at the University of Michigan, one of the medical school graduations, one of the scientists, and I came back, he heads NIH, and his, I'm blanking out on his name, but he had taught at Michigan, and he came back, and as part of his commencement speech, he's an amateur musician, and he played a song. And so those students now physicians will certainly remember that.
You know, it's been 12 or 13 years, but if you polled any one of the 400 people in attendance on that day, every single one of them will remember the day Paul sang the financials.
Well, you know, I'm glad you mentioned the music, because I'm a amateur piano player. Note, I do not use the word pianist. I'm a piano player. And I've gotten back into music. I learned as a child, but now I play in healthcare settings. I played at a senior center for a while, for years, and now I play in hospitals. And a friend of mine said, you know, when you go into a hospital, no one wants to be there except staff and you know, physicians and things. And so can be a cold environment when you initially walk in. But if you hear the piano playing, it sort of takes the edge off. And a friend of mine described it as, he said, yeah, you're kind of like a bartender without the booze. And the other thing is that playing the piano, people come up to me and they just want to have a conversation. You know, sometimes it's as simple as, do you play piano? And I go, I hope so. Otherwise, I think I'm wasting your time. But
let's grab the leadership lesson in that. So, I mean, in my experience, the leadership analog is that effective leaders can walk into any cold, sterile room, and because of their approach and even this you know, kind of interesting word, presence, their demeanor, they're able to change the entire environment and the entire feel of it and start the dialogue and get people comfortable. It sounds like that's exactly what you do with the piano.
Yeah, and the music becomes my device for that. Now, what you're talking about is leaders, and I wholeheartedly embrace that. The reason they do is they make themselves accessible and available. And why? Because they engage in a conversation. They'll go up to you and say, Art, you know, what are you doing? And thanks for coming out here, whatever it is. What is it you do? And then if you're a senior executive and I'm the CEO and you're a frontline employee, I go, Art, you know, tell me about the challenges on your office. And then, hey, what can I do to help you? And why? When a senior executive says, how can I help you do your job? That's a powerful ask, you know, and so it brings people to it, and we like that in our leaders.
Absolutely. I use a question I learned from a wonderful young project manager. She taught me a valuable leadership lesson. She was put in charge of a pretty challenging group, and Angela developed her own strategy for dealing with it. She sat down with the group initially, and they had kind of chewed up and spit out a couple of program leads prior to her, and they were literally, they weren't a team by any reasonable definition. They were at war with each other. She looked around the room and asked the question, at the end of this time, when we're successful, what will you say that I did? She stopped them in their tracks, and that question and the subsequent dialogue and her commitment to living up to it changed the nature of the game completely.
What a powerful question, you know, and I like the way we're familiar with the future questions, like looking back in 5 years, what do we want to be remembered for? But I like the twist that she put on it is, how do I want to remember what I did? And
exactly. It's just so powerful. What a brilliant lesson. And I trumpet that lesson, you know, far and wide everywhere I can go. All right, so let me peel the layer of the onion a little bit with respect to your background. What were your early leadership influences?
I'm glad you mentioned that, because, you know, I'm a child of the 60s and whatever. And first of all, it's from my parents. My father was a family physician. My mother was very active in our community with lots of things, interfaith activities, as she still is. God bless her. My mother's 90 now. And so she's still going strong. So they gave me the example of service, if you will. I'm Jesuit educated. And it's funny, when I thought back on it, I don't ever remember hearing the word leadership. And but what I did see was the example of leadership. I saw the Jesuits who taught me and the teachers who taught me led by example, whether we didn't ascribe the word leadership to it,
Mm-hmm.
but they provided the example of their service to us as boys. Hopefully we turned into reasonable young men. Most of us did, but that was their leadership. So in a sense, that's how I learned it. From a more academic thing, it was more from, course study, but more especially my interest in history. And that's why I like Peter Drucker so much, is because all of his books, or so many of them, had historical references in them. And that's where I've learned, whether it's military history or biography, memoir, all of those things resonate with me. And I guess that's getting back to, it's all stories. So
We're kindred spirits on the history front. And, I hang out in classrooms a fair amount. And I have to tell you, I live in fear of that point in time when no one knows who Peter Drucker was or who W. Edwards Deming was. And I make certain that I try to pass that along. But it makes me think of that movie. I know I'm dating us here, but the Beatles movie that's out where nobody in the world remembers who the Beatles were.
Yesterday.
Yeah, right. I haven't seen it yet, but I love the premise.
It's a treat. It's a real treat.
My thinking about the world, particularly of Drucker and Deming. I just don't want the world to forget those people. They're still relevant today.
Without question. And, Deming had the discipline of his management style, and Drucker embellished it with the responsibility of management and the responsibility of leadership. And so, yeah, you're right. It's a good thing to keep in mind.
No doubt about it. No doubt. So I suppose the question is, what has changed? Not necessarily about leadership, although maybe that's germane, but what has changed about leading in today's world versus when you and I were starting out?
Well, I have a cop-out answer, and my cop-out answer is nothing, because I don't believe that leadership has changed at all since when we recognized it. I mean, in the sense of responsibility for leaders and guiding forward. I think what has changed, a couple of things. One is delegated leadership, distributive leadership, whatever we use it, empowerment, all of those things, pushing leadership decision-making to the front lines has changed. The other thing, and thank God, is gender. More and more, I heard a talk years ago by Pete Dawkins, who was a former military officer. I believe he's the last Heisman Trophy winner at Army. He won in like 58, and then served in a number of roles, and then went into corporate life. But he said, traditionally we always thought of the model of a leader is the 19th century British cavalry officer. Obviously is male, handsome, rode a horse, had a good looking uniform, had a sword. Well, that doesn't really cut it in today's world. And unfortunately, we have more and more research shows that women certainly outpoint men in so many leadership attributes. And so thank God that women are coming into the forefront of leadership positions. Not enough, but that's changed. The other thing which has changed is velocity. With our 24/7 cycle, our global economy, so many businesses are intertwined. Whether they have operations abroad, they're affected by companies that have operations abroad. So we are a global community, which I view as a positive, but it makes it more challenging and it makes it more time demanding. Mm-hmm. So you and I both agree that leaders never really say, it's not my job, but there is a point where they limitations on their availability. Why? For their own mental and physical health. So they have to be available, but how they're available is another thing. So leaders deserve especially senior leaders, they need their downtime, and failure to take downtime exacts a toll. It's like if you're working all the time, you essentially become drunk. in the sense of your processing power. What would take you 20 minutes may take 3 hours.
Right, right.
You need to shut down. You need to go on vacation. You need to spend time with friends. You need to pursue your hobby. All of these things is the self-enrichment, if you will. It's not selfish. It's actually you're doing it for your own health, but you're doing it for the community of those that you lead.
Right, right. Well said. I mean, there's a lot in there that we could unpack. My perspective, I agree with you that leadership fundamentally hasn't changed over civilization. The context, however, in which we lead is dramatically different today than when, for example, I started in the tech world in the 1980s. Dramatically different. And that, I think, creates the need for certain behaviors to emerge and for leaders to adapt. It's time compression, it's risk, it's volatility, it's all of these different topics that are just so profound in contrast to, when I got into the workforce 30 years ago.
Right, and I think the easy word was the person at the top was it's me, and now we move to we, which I know it becomes a cliche, but effective organizations are those that are embrace the talents and include the talents of a broad spectrum of people, because you're never going to achieve it if the leader is calling all the shots. Right. That's a limited ability, and then when you get in trouble, boy, you're really in trouble because there's no one else.
So let's put you on the spot with a scenario here. You have a chance to sit down with a child. The child is curious about the world of leadership and leading. Effectively, the question is, what is leadership? How do you respond to that?
Leadership is about doing whatever it is that others need you to do. Mm-hmm. And when times are easy, that's fine, because you don't do much, a sense, except keep your eye on what's happening. But it's everything when times are challenging, because there needs to be a steady hand on the helm, or the tiller, whatever metaphor you want. Right. And so you need to be guiding, but also you need to mobilize. And as I said earlier, leaders can never say it's not my job. It's more exactly, they say it's not my responsibility. It is always your responsibility. And so you mobilize people to do what needs to be done. And it's a challenge. It also, I think there's something that we don't talk enough about in leadership, and that's the notion of sacrifice.
Okay.
And what do you mean by sacrifice? It's leaders, and certainly corporate leaders, are well compensated. But what they do sacrifice is their time, because when you're in a senior leadership position, you have less time for self and less time for family and friends and commitments. And so for some people, that's not an issue. But it's also that kind of sacrifice in the organizational standpoint, when you have to make the decisions, but you have to make the hard choices. And it's not between right and wrong. It's always between maybe two bad choices or two right choices. Which ones do you do? And by bad choices, I don't mean ethical, but I mean like laying people off or closing a factory. Those are hard, tough choices. And by right choices, I mean two equally qualified people. Whom do you promote? Those kinds of things. So those are the tough decisions. And it takes a toll on an individual. And so there's only so much you can live at the top in that world, because I think it takes a lot out of you. So you need to continually regenerate.
Sure. That doing what other people need is such a powerful statement. Now, fast forward, a couple of decades or so, and that precocious child is now a new manager who's staring around, facing the reality of a group of individuals who have no particular reason or interest in that person leading or managing them. What's your guidance to that individual at that point in time?
It's kind of like what they teach our young officers in the military when you're a second lieutenant or whatever the rank, your first officer corps rank is, and that's listen to your troops. There's an old saying in the Army, when the second lieutenant comes in fresh out of OCS or the academy, whatever, as he meets with the first sergeant, and the sergeant says, the good ones say, you tell us what to do, let me run the troops. And so in other words, I know the mechanics, you just provide the direction. So the most important thing is to listen and to be available and to advocate for others. Rich Tierlink, who ran Harley Davidson in the early 80s when they went through their IPO. Rich came out of a union household, and when he was 26 years old, he was an accountant by background, and he was promoted into management. And his father said, you know, Rich, now you are now the most important person in your employee's life. And Rich was saying, what, me? I'm just a kid, you know, thinking he was, and he was a kid. But he said, no, you're responsible for their vacation, their hours, their time, the jobs they do. And so from an early age, he learned responsibility. And so that's what good people do. Don't try to go in and make your mark, per se, by doing rash things or calling attention to yourself. Work with others, listen, find out the needs, make the tough choices when you can, but, you know, listen more than you speak.
Mm-hmm. Great, great. So your most recent book, number 14, if anyone's counting, that's just incredibly impressive, by the way. So congratulations. Grace, A Leader's Guide to a Better Us. You know, it's interesting. I wrestled with the entire time that I was reading the book, my perspective on the word grace. So, and I sense this is something, well, I sense it's something really important to you. I actually, when I was reading this book, I could kind of feel, maybe I'm making this up, but I could feel the importance of this entire topic to you and a message you wanted to share with the world out there. But maybe as a starting point, what do you mean by a word grace that can mean balance and elegance, or it can mean something spiritual as existing in a state of grace? You're somewhere slightly off of those, yet related.
Yes, and to me, grace is the catalyst for the greater good. We know it often from our faith-based traditions and some of us, but grace is actually inherent in all faiths: Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, and frankly, when you think about it, we're genetically wired this way. Our DNA, we are at least wired to care for others, at least within our family. I mean, that's the DNA part of us, you know, so we're wired. So my idea of grace is the greater good is that understanding that, and from a leadership position, what do you do with it? We say grace is a gift given without strings, so it's a turnaround. It becomes becomes paying it forward, but more alive, it's seeing a need and solving it, which essentially is what leadership does. So the way I anchor grace is, I've done, as you know, done a lot of work with purpose, and purpose begins with our why. That's not my unique thing. A lot of people talk about that, but purpose sparks our vision, which is our becoming, and it also sparks our mission, which is our doing. Grace, I think, affects our how, our values. What do we believe and how do we want to achieve it? So for the entrepreneurs in the audience or anyone, you can achieve the vision and mission with people or in spite of people. I think it's sustainable that you do it with people, and grace becomes that facilitation. It's looking at people initially as contributors always, but giving them the benefit of the doubt. And it's harder in our culture because we are so linked to stereotypes. Maybe it comes from our branding culture. We go into a supermarket and there's a shelf full of cereal, and we know what brand we want, and we go zero in on that. We don't look at anything else. So I think that has kind of leads us to read people in the same way. Grace is the is the exact opposite of that.
Right.
It's looking at an individual and not making prejudicial assumptions about that. And that's kind of what I think that grace in our culture now, our public discourse is uncivil. And I think we need to get back to the civility and the comity. Certainly we can't all agree, nor should we all agree on anything. That's not healthy either. But we can treat others with comity, grace, courtesy, and those are elements of grace.
Well said. And my favorite line, I think, on grace was literally grace, the disposition to do something more for others. that seems to be a theme that underlies just about everything you talk about, write about, speak about over and over again. So that I'd like to tattoo that on my forearm.
Well, you're very kind. Thank you. And that's really thank you for reminding it. I write things and I forget what I write. So thanks for reminding me.
Yeah, by the way, isn't that annoying as a writer? People ask me, what the most recent, I can't remember what I wrote yesterday. The concepts are there, the themes.
I suffer from that too. And it's funny, as a speechwriter, when I was a writer for hire, wordsmith for hire, if you will, it was a virtue because it meant that I wasn't repeating myself. I kind of flush things from my mind so I could be fresh. I take the wisdom of the experience, but not the words. And I think the same applies to the work that we do. Obviously, there are themes that I repeat again and again, but I don't try not to use the same words. And if I do, then I'm probably ready for me to hang it up. But no, I agree with you. Right.
All right, truth serum, John. Have you ever written something and then partway through it or at the end of it say, I think I wrote this before?
Oh, I'm certain I have. And
I've done it a few times.
So, yeah,
I did this 7 years ago, and it was great, and we just rewrote the thing. So, yeah, it's interesting. So the grace, you as you describe it, you conveniently found an acronym in the letters of the word grace. Which one of those jumps out at you as the most powerful, or do they all have to come packed together?
Well, it's a good question. First of all, G is generosity, respect, action, compassion, energy. The generosity, respect, and compassion are all tied together, all aspects of greater sense of love, if you will. The action and the energy are components of leadership because leaders by nature are activists. They do. And they must energize the organization at the same time they keep their own energy level high. So what do we forget in all of those? I think sometimes of those 5 attributes, maybe compassion. And why compassion? I think it's because leaders don't know that they have. One of the gentlemen that I quote in the book is Scott Moorhead from an organization. He's the CEO of Round. I'm blanking out. Round Room,
okay. Right.
Which is a entrepreneurial venture, and is also of TCC, which is a telephone, mobile phone retailer. So what Scott talks about is, and he's a dynamic leader, young man, and very dynamic, talks a lot about giving people permission to care. So as a leader, as a manager in your organization, most people do care about their people, but they don't know that how much they can care. And we don't want a leader who's a meddler. We don't want people getting into our personal affairs. That's fine. We don't need people meddling in our politics, whatever those are. But if a leader makes himself or herself available to listen about whatever's going on in the life of that individual, that's that permission to care. Further to that, it's a challenge, as Scott has done, is lives the philanthropy of action through his own service, but the example of serving the community. What TCC does in its communities with its school outreach programs, its teacher programs, all of these things are permission to care from our community. So I think we forget compassion, not because we're selfish individuals, but because we don't give ourselves that permission to care.
Mm-hmm. Well said. So I love the connection that you offer between listening and compassion. In Tom Peters' latest book, he as only Tom Peters can, he drubs us into submission on some core things we need to do more of, not the least of which is listen. I believe he says, and I think I can say that, listen, damn it, exclamation point somewhere in there. And his entire perspective is, listening is so powerful. It shows that you respect someone. You can begin to build empathy with people. And by the way, at the end of a conversation, if you're not sweating from trying to listen, you're not listening hard enough. I love that viewpoint.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad he puts that, because sometimes so often we think of listening as a passive exercise, when of course it's not. We know the term active listening, which means engaged listening, ask questions. But really it is work, and particularly for a senior person, because sometimes the person speaking to you out of nerves or whatever isn't as articulate as he or she could be, or maybe their thoughts are not fully formulated, so you kind of have to draw them out, or they might be long-winded, whatever that. So it takes, you have to be focused to draw the thought out of them before you can evaluate it.
Sure. And just as a personal sidebar too, all the different experts and interesting individuals you had commenting on the different aspects of Grace, those were fabulous. And one, and I know you can't comment, but one that I loved more than all was Elena Love's perspective. Every time she wrote something, it just stopped me in my tracks and made me think about it.
Oh, that's great. You're the second person that has called out Elena's comments. So she's a wonderful, she's a good friend of mine, and her work and purpose and passion are quite spectacular. And she's a regular contributor, of course, to our vehicle, Smart Brief, let's call it out. James De Silva is a wonderful editor and brings so many talents like yours and mine to the forefront, and Elena too. So yes, Elena is a person of great depth, and a good and insightful person, and just a wonderful talent, and she speaks with conviction.
Just fabulous. So I've kind of figured out a little bit of the secret sauce on in your books. You're the master of the one-word compelling title. So you had a book called Moxie, one of your most recent books as well. That's a term we don't hear every day, but fascinating, because we kind of have the sense of it. What do you mean by moxie, and how does
moxie is, if I was smarter, I would say it's the grit and gumption. Grit's now become a more accepted word, but I've always liked the term moxie. It comes from movies. Well, there's a soda in the north up in Maine.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, but it was a slang term in the 30s and 40s, and we hear it in movies about someone who has gumption, and it's that get up and go, whether that's that prize fighter on his last legs who's going into the ring for one last time, or as we would say, the gangster mall, who's going to stand up for the truth and call the police on the nefarious actions of the gang. That's moxie, those types of things. But moxie to me is that your grit and determination, but it's not simply guts and gumption. It's focused on a goal. What is it you want to apply your determination toward? What is it you want to achieve? And as I did with Grace, I turned it into an acronym.
Right.
And it's mindfulness, opportunity, looking for X factor, which is character, and innovation. And then those are kind of inward developing things. And then the hinge is engage, E for engagement. That's the reach out. That's the connection part. So in a way, and how Grace and Moxie complement one another, Moxie's focused on an individual purpose and then outwardly focused toward the organization. Grace becomes the how we do things.
I think they're a complementary read. I really do. I think you need to read one with the other. So there's my plug for the book sales there, but
Thank you.
Genuinely mean it. They really are complementary components for each other. So interestingly, in my audience here, the people who are listening and watching, probably the biggest issue that they navigate over and over again, and it comes up on all of our webinars, in our conference calls, on our coaching calls for the one-on-one coaching, are communications related issues. And you shared one secret earlier. And while of course we want people to check out your book, The Secrets of Great Communicators, is that the right title? Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
You never know with me, so I sometimes make titles up as we go. It's a bad habit.
I do too.
What are one or two other areas that you find that you need to coach individuals on that they really benefit from? Story certainly was one of those. No doubt about it.
As they pertain to communication?
Yes.
I think it's to look at communication as a holistic process in the sense of connection. How do we connect to one another? And getting back to Grace, one of the folks that I talk about is Father Greg Boyle, who was a Jesuit priest in East Los Angeles and created Homeboy Industries, the largest gang intervention program in the world, I think. And Father Boyle talks a lot about connection, and the way of, and his subtitle of his new book is called Barking to the Choir. It's a kind of play on words that a lot of the people he works with are bilingual, or maybe kind of a monolingual, a patois of Spanish and English together, and they kind of mix up our metaphors to humorous effect that Father Boyle has a great fun with. But he also, the subtext is the radical kinship. Now, what is a radical kinship? It's the connection that between all of us that unites us. And communication then becomes our avenue of connection. So much of communication, we always say this, is nonverbal, all right? So some people, extroverts among us, feel that they have to fill the world, fill the space with words. Those who are more introverted don't. They are need to just simply listen. The balance is in between. Speak when you have to speak, and listen when you have to speak, when you need to listen. But more importantly, it's how are you relating to that person? And I also look at communication as behavior. So also, it's like walk the talk. And in other words, it's talk's cheap. What are your actions? So it's one thing to say something, it's another thing to follow up. So I think follow up is important in communication. And that is when you and I work on a job and you work for me, I want you to report to me at a cadence that we determine, or whatever the management determines. And if there are changes, keep me in the loop and I keep you in the loop. And if you ask me for something and I don't have the answer, I don't have the resources, I keep you in the loop. And I also follow up with you regularly, not necessarily checking up on you, Art, but what do you need? What do you know? What's happening? So being connected. There's a mantra I learned from a book called Hope is Not a Method by General Sullivan, who was once Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, and he quoted it from a combat example in Vietnam. And it was an officer whose name escapes me. Shame on me, my memory's going, see? It talks about, in a combat situation, he was saying, what's happening, what is not happening, what can I do to influence the action? I think that's a good mantra for managers to ask personally, but also in staff sessions. And I changed the words a little bit. So what's happening? That's our diagnostic. It's pretty easy. What are we doing? What's not happening requires some thinking, what are the challenges? What are the impediments? What are we not seeing? Oh, this is deep thinking. And then what must I or we do to influence the outcome? It's not so much the action, right, as it might be in combat, but the outcome in the sense of what do we want things to occur, and what must we all do together? So that's what's happening, what's not happening, what must I do to influence the outcome? That's a good mantra for communication.
That is great guidance, no doubt about it. So as we kind of wind things down here, again, I loved Grace. I suspect that book will have a long tail for you. It's such a powerful message coming through it. What did you learn about yourself in writing that book?
It's a good question. I learned that I want to write about issues that have an impact beyond the workforce, but maybe on society at whole, but to help, my vision is to help men and women learn to lead more purposefully. That's my purpose statement. Right. So Grace is my way of exploring issues and avenues, behaviors that we can make things better for one another. And, change happens one person at a time. And if we all had more grace, our workplace, our communities, our world would be a better place. That's a pie in the sky, but it's a pretty long proven concept, far beyond my pay grade. But things are better when we're more kind to one another.
Yeah, again, as I said, and whether I was imputing that my read of the author, you, the author's drive behind that book was this is something really important to you. That came through loud and clear.
Thank you. I'm glad it did, because it is very important, because it's in a way, for me, it's a new chapter to explore deeper issues, if you
Sure,
will,
sure.
human behavior and connection between
Yeah,
us.
wonderful. So, John, where can people find more of your fabulous content and learn more about you and your programs and services?
Well, thank you. The easiest thing is simply my website, which is johnbaldoni.com. That has a link to all of my books. My books are all available on Amazon, bookstores. Some bookstores have my books, some don't, but they can all be ordered through there, but certainly Amazon or Barnes & Noble online as well, or Barnes & Noble, the store, but also online.
And then you mentioned one of our favorite publications, Smart Brief. We can
Yes,
find you regularly there.
yes, I contribute twice a month for them, and I also write for Forbes.com. So.
Fabulous. John, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for spending your time with us and more importantly, sharing your wonderful wisdom. So you help make the world a better place, and I appreciate you as I know so many others do.
Well, Art, you've very kind to bring me on your program, and I feel likewise about you, and you're doing good things, and it's a pleasure to be associated with you. So thank you.
Thank you. Take care, John.